History of a Teacher by Famous Fault. Chapter 19. Christmas Sorrow. What happened to Professor Umbridge? Professor McGonagall asked them furiously that evening. About an hour after dinner, Hagrid had carried Umbridge into the castle. The still screaming woman had been sent to the hospital wing where Madame Pomfrey tried to remove the illusions without any success. The students had cheered at the news without even trying to hide their joy. It had made Filch angry, really angry, but no one even cared. Harry could have sworn that even many of the teachers were more concerned about the fact that something like that happened than about Umbridge herself. Now, not much later, everyone who had been present at the class where Umbridge had freaked out had been gathered in the Great Hall. Hagrid too. Professor McGonagall, Professor Snape, and Professor Dumbledore were the ones leading the interrogation. The entire hall remained silent, and they all stared at the ground. Enraged, Professor McGonagall repeated her question. Still no one spoke. "Doesn't any of you care that a human being is being tortured without any way for us to undo it?" Professor McGonagall cried out when she completely lost her temper. "What's wrong with you?" Everyone was still staring at the ground, including Harry, Hermione, and Ron. But when someone in the crowd of gathered students spoke, all the rest of them stared at that person instead. "Umbridge got what she deserved," Dean said, and looked Professor McGonagall straight in the eyes. "She's done many terrible things, but this time she crossed the line. She should have been submitted to worse." Several students nodded in approval. "She'll probably be just fine," Dean added. "I'm sure she'll be back to teaching in the morning." "Mr. Thomas, you seem awfully sure of that. Could you please enlighten us all on how you know that?" Professor Snape said coldly. No matter how brave Dean had been the last few days, not even he could stand up to the chilly tones of Snape's voice. Theodore Nott, on the other hand, could. "Professor, not one of us is going to tell what happened there today. I believe I can safely state that there is a silent agreement among all of us. Umbridge got what she deserved. What she did, who punished her, and how to make it stop will be forever kept silent about. I'm sure even Umbridge is in on this silent agreement for her own benefit." With those words, Nott left the room, and several of the other students, Slytherins and Gryffindors alike, threw McGonagall and Snape a gloomy and slightly sad look before turning and leaving too. Professor McGonagall made a noise in protest, but Dumbledore put a hand on her shoulder. "Let them go, Minerva. All we can do is hope Dean is right. I believe I know who to talk to, anyway." Harry took that as a sign of dismissal, and gloomy as all the rest, he, Hermione, and Ron left to catch a good night's sleep. Yugi was summoned to the headmaster's office the day after. As Dean had predicted, Umbridge had recovered towards the morning hours and claimed she had no memory of what had happened. Yugi knew it was a lie, and Umbridge did her very best to keep away from him. Yugi was now almost sure that Umbridge wouldn't dare to sack him, though he wasn't quite glad about the way it had happened. As Tim had thought, Umbridge didn't change at all. She was jumpy and slightly paranoid, but she was just as wicked and power-hungry as ever before. "She's blackened to the core. It is not possible to remove her malice without killing her," Tim told Yugi when the latter had expressed his disappointment on the outcome of the shadow game. With dragging steps, Yugi made his way up the stairs towards Dumbledore's office and knocked on the door. "Come in," Dumbledore said, and Yugi slowly opened the door with one hand. He took some feeble steps into the office. Dumbledore was sitting behind his desk, writing something down in a little blue book. "Ah, Yugi, come in." Yugi went even further inside. "You summoned me. May I ask why?" You speak English much better now than you did when we met first time. Did you use magical means to remove your accent and evolve your vocabulary to beyond normal standards, or are you simply that talented with languages?" Dumbledore asked, and Yugi raised his caution slightly more. Dumbledore closed the little blue book and stood up to put it back on its shelf. Then he returned to his chair. "A gift from a good Samaritan, a language potion that does wear off in about 10 years. Quite useful. I have little skill with language," Yugi answered truthfully. "However, that is no answer to my question." "Is there a need for you to be so distrusting towards me?" Dumbledore asked, and Yugi noticed how much different this man was in the place he called home than outside the school. The old warlock was far more relaxed here than he had been in Yugi's room at the Leaky Cauldron. "I distrust people in general. Why would I make an exception for anyone? It wouldn't be fair, don't you agree?" Yugi said, having decided that he was going to answer every question with a question himself until Dumbledore decided to start speaking business. Dumbledore nodded. "Indeed, it wouldn't be fair." There hung a heavy silence in the room a couple of minutes, and eventually a grim look appeared on Dumbledore's face.
I believe you know why I summoned you.
Do I? Yugi said, and raised an eyebrow as he crossed his arms and leaned slightly backwards. A pose that no one else could do the way the pharaoh did, but even Yugi could seem intimidating that way after a whole lot of practice and patience. Dumbledore didn't seem to be affected in the least by the younger's hostile appearance.
Yes, I'm sure you do. Are you by any means responsible for what happened to Dolores yesterday?
Yugi remained silent, not willing to lie, and concentrating on Dumbledore's eyes, who were now staring straight into his. Atem had drawn himself into his soul room so he wouldn't distract Yugi, but had still been listening. Yugi was surprised to hear the spirit speak from his soul, something that in itself wasn't so unusual. It was who the words were directed to, which surprised Yugi.
I warn you, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, do not attempt to invade my partner's mind.
Yugi, who hadn't noticed the invasion at all, took Dumbledore's startled look as confirmation of Atem's words, and his eyes narrowed.
As you are in the corridor that divides our mind, and most importantly souls, you haven't come too far yet. Turn around, otherwise I'll draw you into the labyrinth my soul once was, and leave you there to find your way out yourself. I must tell you my traps are hard to avoid. The last person invading our mind would have been trapped forever, hadn't it been for Yugi's kind heart. The kind of heart he doesn't possess any longer, so don't expect help from him. I've warned you. I'm a far better occlumant than you are a legilimist. The shadows are not merciful on invaders.
Dumbledore took some surprised steps backwards.
Yes, I should have known. You felt dark the moment I met you. Dark and protective. A dangerous combination. All I care about is the student's well-being. Please, Yugi, can I take over?
Atem asked the still somewhat confused Yugi gently. Yugi didn't answer, but just withdrew to his soul room to ponder of what Atem just had said. Atem might not have noticed it, but his words had troubled Yugi slightly.
Communicating like this is more pleasant, isn't it? Of course, you've never seen the labyrinth,
Atem said, with a faint smile that disappeared nearly at once.
It was me, and not Yugi, who was responsible for what happened to Dolores Jane Umbridge. I will not say I regret it. Did anyone tell you what happened?
Dumbledore shook his head.
The students wouldn't speak a word. They too said that Dolores got what she deserved, which makes me curious on what happened. I want to know if injustice is done to my students.
Dumbledore sounded calm, and Atem knew that this could continue for quite a while if he didn't end the conversation.
Umbridge is fine now. She could tell you if she wanted to, but she chose not to. I submitted her to a test, and I am afraid she failed it. Once it was my job to punish those with a weak heart. Before I retrieved my memories, many have suffered punishments alike that of Umbridge. What she did, however, is one of the worst things I've ever seen, and I must say I've seen a lot. There is little else to be said. If you want to get rid of me, just tell me, and I'll take my leave.
Atem said, and took some steps backwards.
Though I can't promise the same for Yugi. After all, it's his life,
the spirit added. After that, he turned around briskly and walked out of the room. He stopped outside the room with his hand still on the knob. He looked over his shoulder and met Dumbledore's gaze. Dumbledore watched the young man leave without a word, and was slightly taken aback when the other spoke.
For the record, I might have screwed up once, but I, too, have the student's best interest in mind. You should remember that I even have personal ties among them, and I'm not going to stand by as the students are being slaughtered one by one. I can't be Schindler, but I can be the difference on the scale.
Atem closed the door behind him, leaving a deeply touched Dumbledore behind.
What was that all about?
Armando Dippet asked from his portrait, and Dumbledore turned around to face his predecessor.
What happened? Who is that child?
He's no child, Armando. In fact, he's the oldest person I know. Old and tortured,
Dumbledore whispered, and had the attention of all the portraits.
Please, Albus, he's just a child,
Eosia Shakadenbird said, and looked at the headmaster with a worried frown.
He's no child, Eosia. The person you just saw is a man with incredible power. He knows that, and yet he wants to do good. Who am I to question his methods?
Dumbledore wondered.
He admits his mistakes and flaws, and my belief is that he's suffering far more than he lets anyone know. I do not know his history, but it appears sad.
And can't you trust him?
Dippet questioned, skeptical.
Dumbledore shook his head. No, I do not, and he knows it. He accepts it. He's used to people not trusting, to people hating him. Especially in our world, that is understandable. We fear beings like him, those that take control over us, like he could do to Yugi. The relation between that old spirit and the young man to who that body belongs is one I've never seen before. It brings me hope,
Dumbledore confessed.
You should know more before letting such a being in this school,
Armando Dibbit said, upset.
I know I took a risk. I underestimated his power, and I know nothing about his history. He is not willing to share it. Neither do I know why he possessed Yugi, or if their mere presence could call forth threats, which I cannot deal with. But what I do know is that he is on our side in this war. He might have unique techniques, but I believe he does want what's best for the students. A childhood friend of him is a fourth-year student.
He must be a very powerful wizard for you to take such a risk, just to win a war. The outcome is already decided. Why do you need him?
Dibbit asked in an attempt to provoke Dumbledore to tell as much as possible.
I don't think any prophecy took him into account. He's no wizard. The power he controls is older than ours, and far darker. It has a will of its own. Lucius Malfoy made the two of them suffer great losses, and changed the course of destiny when doing it so.
Dumbledore explained to his predecessor.
No wizard. Yet he is here.
Phineas Nigellus Black burst out.
What does he do here?
He teaches history. He's left quite the impact,
Dumbledore said calmly.
You let a muggle teach our history?
Phineas asked, horrified.
No, I let him teach his history, or Muggle history. I'm quite sure that the spirit could teach much more history than anyone else could,
Dumbledore replied, still calm.
But why?
Phineas Black didn't seem to be able to say anything but that anymore.
Because the Muggles have a history unexplored by many wizards, and from their history, too, there is lots to learn. A war, much in the style of the one that is about to break out, has already happened in the Muggle world, and young Yugi teaches them about that war. A war that contains horror beyond my imagination. Minerva tipped me on a book about a young girl who did not survive the war just because she was a Jew. They hid behind a bookcase for several years, only to be betrayed and later killed.
Dibbit sighed.
Then if he is no wizard, what is he, besides from an old spirit possessing a young man's body?
I do not know the true nature of his power, but it is dark, very dark. A servant of Tom has already tried to rid the world of this power, but didn't succeed. Instead, he awoke the rage of the odd pair, a rage that will be beneficial to us in the coming war.
December and the Christmas feast arrived without any more drama. No one ever learned about Yugi's part in what happened to Umbridge, and Umbridge herself hadn't changed a bit. The evening of the Christmas feast, everyone was in a good mood, including Yugi. Rebecca would be going home the day after, and Yugi had been invited too. Together, they'd fly to America and spend the holidays there. Yugi was looking forward to it, but he was nervous. Rebecca was the first one of his friends who he'd seen in 4 years, and the thought of meeting his grandpa's best friend again was scaring. Not because Arthur Hawkins was so scary, but more because Yugi was ashamed. Though all those thoughts and feelings were whisked away for the feast, and Yugi had to say that Christmas in the magical world was something truly extraordinary. 12 huge trees were put in the Great Hall, and from the magical ceiling, snow was falling. There were decorations everywhere, and both Yugi and Rebecca stared their eyes out, to Peter's and Tim's amusement. Peter and Rebecca were together more and more often, and they were on occasion also with Dean and Tracy. The fact that Tracy was a werewolf had spread through the school like a wildfire, and no one knew whom told whom to begin with. As expected, many of the Muggle-borns reacted without much drama, while several pure-blood wizards refused to even come close to her with the whole scene. Things didn't get easier for Tracy. Several of the girls who she shared a dorm with refused to sleep in the same room any longer, and Tracy willingly moved out, despite Dumbledore's assurance that no such thing was necessary. Yugi wasn't quite sure where the Slytherin slept now, but she seemed a lot happier. It was a weird thing to behold. Tracy walked through the hallways, smiling, whistling, and laughing, while she got death threats from parents, hateful glances from students, and had been thrown out from Umbridge's classes. Umbridge had plainly refused to teach something that wasn't human. The fifth years were getting more and more rebellious, and everyone who was the least supportive of Tracy had stood up and left. Only some Slytherins stayed. Umbridge was starting to notice how powerless she truly was, and out of desperation, her punishments became more and more cruel. Tracy was now with Professor Snape during the times she normally had defense against the dark arts, and he taught her instead. Tracy never told anyone about the lessons, but there was no doubt Professor Snape was a good, if somewhat impatient, teacher on the subject. The result was that Harry and Tracy were teaching the DA together, as Tracy had learned a whole bunch of tricks none of them could even have imagined. The attitude towards her had become much more friendly now that everyone in the DA knew what she was and weren't afraid that she'd betray them anymore. All this information Yugi received from Rebecca, who told him nearly everything. She was his eyes and ears in the school, and Yugi told Rebecca what was going on among the teachers, something which on occasion had saved the DA from being exposed, unbeknownst to the members of it. And that was exactly how Yugi liked it, working from the dark without anyone knowing it. The chatter in the great hall was loud and the mood high. People laughed and joked, and Yugi caught Dumbledore looking at the students with a warm affection. Yugi couldn't help but sigh. "I'm quite sure our teachers never looked at us like that," Yugi said, and Atem didn't have to ask who us was. The Pharaoh merely chuckled. When Yugi's eyes fell upon the Slytherin table, he saw something he didn't like. Tracy was sitting alone at the far end. She smiled an odd smile that was neither sad nor happy, but thoughtful. That exact moment, one voice raised above the others. "Hey, Tracy! Come sit with us!" Seamus Finnegan yelled, and both he and Dean waved their hands over their head, and Neville laughed out loud. "Yeah!" Lee Jordan added. "No sour faces at the Christmas feast! Stop sulking and join us! You're welcome!" Even Yugi could see that she turned bright red, despite the fact that he was sitting across the room. She looked down and did as if she hadn't heard them, despite the fact that the entire hall had. Yugi recognized the smile that appeared on Rebecca's face, and when she leaned closer to Peter and had a short exchange of words with him, they both stood up swiftly. Yugi leaned backwards and crossed his arms with an amused smile on his face. A smile that neither Madame Rouge nor Snape on either side of him missed, and they too waited to whatever would happen. Peter and Rebecca silently made their way towards Tracy, who hadn't noticed that the entire hall had fallen silent, waiting for Rebecca and Peter's move. When Tracy noticed that everything had fallen silent and looked up, the two Ravenclaws started to run. Tracy was just in time to cry out, "Rebecca, no!" before the said girl and partner in crime reached Tracy. Both of them started to tickle the helpless Slytherin until she literally slid down from the bench in an attempt to get away from her attackers. That seemed to have been their goal, for Peter and Rebecca took an arm each and literally dragged Tracy over the floor towards the Gryffindor table. Tracy did an attempt to stand up several times, but Rebecca would just start tickling her again until the tears were streaming down her face and she was crying out for them to stop. They were halfway across the great hall when Dean interfered. He stood up, walked towards the trio, and put one hand around the neck of both the Ravenclaws.
I'll see you little devils. Leave my girlfriend alone.
He gave them a little shake. It could have looked vicious hadn't it been for the laughter that Peter and Rebecca were both trying to hold back. Yugi threw Umbridge a hasty glance. The pink-clad woman was looking away from the four in the middle of the hall briskly. He knew that if Umbridge had a say, every werewolf would be rounded up and killed on the spot, including Tracy. It was a scary thought that someone gaining authority in the school had such a vision. Atem sighed in agreement, where he was standing next to Yugi, but smiled when he returned his attention to Dean, Tracy, Peter, and Rebecca.
So,
Dean said with a smile.
you want to give them some sort of payback?
He cocked his head and looked at Tracy, who shook her head. No, I don't think... Tracy fell silent, and with that, all sound in the great hall disappeared. Atem closed his eyes. He felt something. Whatever it was, he felt it wasn't good. There was something in the silence that foresaw something that couldn't be described in any other way but horrible. It was the sort of anticipation, and everyone prayed silently that this silence wasn't for them. This wasn't the silent minute after a crash. This was the silent moment before the crash. An owl as black as the night soared into the great hall and gave a screech that spoke of dead and despair. It flew circles around the room, and Dean let go of Peter and Rebecca. Then it flew lower, 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 and lower, until it landed at last. It landed on the Ravenclaw table, on the spot where Peter had sat only a minute ago. Peter and Rebecca exchanged a glance that spoke of sheer terror. Yugi stood up without noticing it himself. Together, the two fourth years started to walk towards their seats, and Dean put an arm around Tracy as the couple slowly followed the two terrified Ravenclaws, while keeping some distance. Every eye in the room was upon them. Peter reached his seat and gave the scared Rebecca an unconvincing smile. In that moment, Yugi knew that there was something that everyone missed but what he and Rebecca knew. This letter wasn't for Peter. They both knew it. With shaking hands, Peter loosened the letter and looked at it while turning it. Yugi realized what was wrong, not due to his eyes, but due to his ears. The note sounded wrong. It wasn't parchment, but original paper. It was square and small, and it was nothing short of a wonder that it had survived the trip. It's for you, Peter started and gave Rebecca the tiny envelope. Rebecca took it from him and opened it, all the time staring into Peter's eyes. Inside the envelope there was a card, and for a moment Yugi was sure that it was a Christmas card. A very small, very white Christmas card. He placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. He barely noticed that Madame Hooch put a hand on his arm. When Rebecca had gathered the courage to look down, she did so very slowly and stared. She just stared at the card, while every soul in the great hall was waiting for her reaction. Yugi didn't know if the tension in the room increased or decreased when Rebecca took a step forwards, staring at the card all the time. She was pale, as if she'd seen a ghost. She took more slow steps forward, and eventually it became clear who she was heading for as she came closer and closer to the teacher's table. Yet no one interfered as she took a step onto the small podium the table was placed upon. She was still looking at the card, and an icy hand held Yugi's heart. When nothing but the table separated Rebecca from the king of games, she looked up into Yugi's eyes with a gaze that was empty, and she gave him the card. Yugi took it without letting her go with his eyes. He recognized that emptiness, and he didn't have to look down to know what was on the card. Eventually, he did anyway. He had to do something to break the deadlock they had gotten into. They had all gotten into. In loving memory of Arthur Hawkins, beloved grandfather and boss. Yugi didn't look at the date nor the picture. The name took all his vision before it turned hazy. He dropped the card on the table. Oh, Rebecca. Those words broke the tension, and the time that had been standing still for such a long time suddenly started moving again. Rebecca sank to the ground in uncontrollable sobs, and Yugi ducked down under the table and hugged the devastated girl tight. She put her face on his shoulder, tears rolling down her cheeks, and her body shaking uncontrollable. Yugi himself was still comprehending. How? Why? He didn't cry. It was far too early. Atem sat down on his knees next to Yugi and put a hand on his lighter's shoulder. Snape picked up the card and gave it to Dumbledore, who read it briefly. The students had erupted into low murmurs once the spell was broken. They all wondered what had happened. Tracy and Dean placed themselves on either side of Peter, and Dean put an arm around the younger male's shoulders. Yugi, who was facing the students, saw all that and closed his eyes. He didn't want to see. He just wanted to shut down. It took several minutes before Rebecca stopped shaking, but when she did, she seemed to regain some control over herself and a bit of her personality. She got up quickly and threw everyone in the room a hateful glare, including Yugi, before running out of the great hall. When the gigantic double doors closed behind her, it was as if a huge beast swallowed her whole. Peter turned around to follow her, but Yugi spoke. Peter Lepard, let her go. You can't do anything for her right now. She has to think. Most of all, she has to get out of this place. Yugi stood up and put his hands in his pockets. He shrugged. So do I, for that matter. Dumbledore gave Yugi the card and nodded. I understand. If you want, you can leave tonight. Yugi shook his head. Tomorrow morning. I think that we should at least do an attempt to get some sleep. With those words, he too turned and walked out of the room. It wasn't until the doors behind him slammed shut that he started running. He went outside and just kept running and running and running until he reached the edge of the lake. There he fell down upon his knees. Why? Damn it, why? A girl's voice sounded through the night. The snow was covering the landscape, but neither Yugi nor Rebecca cared. Why now? I should have been there. I don't belong here, and he dies. Why? Tell me. I have not seen him since the summer, and now he dies. I would have met him tomorrow again. I was only a day away. Now I've never been further. This can't be true. Yugi saw Rebecca at a different part of the lake throwing rocks into the water with great force. She kept shouting out her guilt, her grief, and her anger. She wasn't aware of the short figure kneeling in the cold snow at the edge of the lake. Yugi sat there till his lips turned blue. His tears that eventually started to flow had turned to ice, and Rebecca ran out of anger. Atem had withdrawn into his soul room the moment Rebecca ran out of the great hall, and Yugi hadn't heard from him since. It wasn't like the first time. Then it had been incomprehensible and had been soon followed with anger beyond measure. This time it was grief, pure grief. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Rebecca went silent and sank down against a tree, hugging herself tight, both in sorrow and to expel the cold. Yugi stood up, and Atem appeared next to him in spirit form, nearly invisible due to the darkness that rested over the grounds.
Are you okay?
He asked Yugi.
Overwhelmed,
Yugi said and sighed.
I didn't know Arthur Hawkins that well at all, yet I'm so sad. I hadn't expected to react that strong on his passing. Perhaps it's partly due to the timing. Momentarily, I'm more worried about Rebecca. He was the only family she had. With those words, Yugi walked over towards Rebecca, who from pure exhaustion had fallen asleep out in the cold, and Yugi was grateful that he had followed her outside. It could have ended bad for her, too, if she had fallen asleep outside without being dressed for the cold. He woke her gently, and together they made their way back into the castle in silence. Rebecca just followed Yugi, not really awake. Together they entered Yugi's room, and Rebecca fell asleep on Yugi's bed, clothes and all still on. Dobby?
Yugi called out softly, and with a crack that was louder than Yugi had expected, Dobby appeared.
Is there something Dobby can do?
Dobby asked and fell silent when he saw the expression on Yugi's face.
Is something wrong, Yugi, sir?
Someone I know died, Dobby. Someone I cared for. Do you think you can get me a mattress and some blankets? I believe I'll be sleeping on the floor tonight.
The smile vaporized from Dobby's face.
Is Yugi, sir, all right?
It's never easy, Dobby, but I'll be fine,
Yugi told him with a reassuring smile.
There are others I'm more worried about. Tomorrow, Rebecca and I will be leaving the castle. I wonder who took care of the funeral arrangements. Perhaps Rebecca knows.
It's probably Raphael,
Rebecca said, all but awake. Yugi turned around as if stung. What? He asked the half-sleeping blonde.
Raphael.
It can't be the same,
Atem stated at once, as the same face appeared in both his and Yugi's mind.
It's not possible.
Are you sure? Yugi asked, knowing well that there was no way for Atem to be sure. Atem shook his head as Dobby appeared with a mattress and some blankets. Yugi thanked him and wished him good night. Dobby left.
No, in fact, deep down, I know who it is. So do you, Yugi. I believe we'll be meeting an old acquaintance tomorrow. Make that today.
I've never really met Raphael, Yugi said.
His soul had already been taken when I returned. You are the only one meeting an old acquaintance. Perhaps Rebecca can tell us more when we travel home.
With those words, Yugi lay down on his improvisational bed, and despite the events of the day, he fell asleep at once. Atem, on the other hand, didn't have such needs, like eating and sleeping, and sat down in the windowsill instead. Raphael. Atem wasn't looking forward to the meeting. He wasn't looking forward to anything anymore, he realized. Once upon a time, his life here almost seemed perfect. He remembered thinking that it was okay, that he didn't need anything more, because everything was bright and happy. He hadn't known who he was then. He hadn't had a clue, and then the Ishtars had appeared. It happened more and more often that Atem wished back to the days when he had been clueless but satisfied.
Damn it,
he whispered out into the night, well aware that no one could hear him.
Damn it all. Damn it all.